Thank you very much for joining us. This is our first Trade Justice Alliance Sunday meeting of 2017. We have a great call tonight. Our speakers include Ben Beachy with Sierra Club's Responsible Trade Program. We have Michael Stumo with the Coalition for a Prosperous America, Steve Supan with the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. We have Emilia Tallarico with Disrupt J20 and Dr. Margaret Flowers. There is a lot of uncertainty, as we all know, coming into the Trump presidency, and we will be working to make sure progressive voices are heard when it comes to trade policy. So we're looking forward to hearing from our special guests tonight on some of the most important aspects of trade that work for all people and the planet. Before we dive into the speakers, I wanted to give a quick mention that while Donald Trump likes to imagine that he stopped the TPP, it's very important for all of us to realize that without this cross-border movement of movements crying out for trade justice, TPP would have passed years ago. We have all pulled together. We've held media events. We've held marches and lobbied Congress. And we've worked very hard over the last years. And we should really be very proud of ourselves, because we had a huge win against corporate power. So for that, we should be celebrating, and I'd like to open up the line and let everybody give a shout, but in the interest of speeding things along, we're going to keep moving right along. So right now I'm going to open the line to our first speaker, Ben Beachy. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Ben Beachy is the Senior Policy Advisor with the Sierra Club's Responsible Trade Program. He investigates the implications of U.S. trade policy for environmental protections, including efforts to combat climate change. Formerly, Ben was Research Director for Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, where he analyzed the impacts of U.S. trade, aid and lending policies in Latin America for 6 years as a Nicaragua-based policy analyst and as a D.C.-based national organizer for Witness for Peace. Ben's published articles have focused on post-food crisis trade policy, the impacts of U.S. and IMF policies in Latin America, and new economic indicators to supplement GDP. Mr. Beachy received a BA from Goshen College and a master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. You're welcome to start, Ben.
Cool, thank you. And thanks so much for hosting this call. I think it's very timely to be asking what are we to do as trade justice campaigners in this era of Trump, which is a very confusing era. Many of us, I think, experienced something a bit of whiplash in the election that had to get our bearings straight. Perhaps we should have seen it coming, but many of us did not have strategies laid out for a Trump administration. So I'm glad that you all are taking on these hard questions. So Sierra Club has been one of many groups who's been in this fight against unfair trade deals for years, as all of us have. Because they harm our communities by undermining environmental protections, eliminating jobs, eroding wages, fueling climate change. In short, as we all know, these deals have increased the power and profits of multinational corporations at the expense of people and our planet. And on this slide, you can see, of course, the TPP was a clear-cut example of this model. It was cut from the same neoliberal cloth. And, as Harriet mentioned, all of us killed it as part of an international movement of millions who organized against the TPP for years. It was thanks to that dogged organizing across country lines and across party lines that at no point did the TPP have majority support in the House. Of course, Trump and Clinton both seized on the fact that a broad majority of us don't support status quo trade deals like the TPP, and their continual elevation of NAFTA and the TPP during the election cycle only fueled broad opposition to status quo trade. As a result of all of this, we're seeing really unprecedented rejection of the neoliberal model, which at this point may not be dead, but it appears to have been critically wounded. So the question now is, what should come next? And there's a couple pretty different answers to that question. On this slide, I've tried to put out, some portions of what is a new progressive trade vision that I think many of us share, that's shared by many people who helped defeat the TPP and have been fighting similar deals over the past 2 decades. Our trade vision is rooted in fighting inequality and empowering workers rather than empowering corporations to offshore their jobs. It's focused on supporting family farmers and safe and sustainable food supplies rather than fueling the factory farm model controlled by the likes of Cargill and Monsanto. It's premised on the notion that access to affordable health care is more important than padding the profit margins of pharmaceutical companies. And it's based on the idea that fossil fuel corporations like Exxon do not need to be given any more power via trade deals to undermine our efforts to avert the climate crisis. Next slide. And critically, all of this, prioritization of human needs over corporate greed does not stop at our borders. We reject TPP-like deals because they exacerbate a climate crisis that is wrecking communities and ecosystems across the world. We say no to this corporate trade model because we think workers everywhere should be paid living wages, not pitted against each other in a global race to the bottom. We oppose the TPP because we think access to affordable medicine is something that everyone deserves, regardless of where they live. So this quest for a new model of trade is not about prioritizing U.S. interests over those of other countries. It is about prioritizing the needs of our planet and communities everywhere over the narrow interests of multinational corporations. Contrast that with Trump's trade vision. Again, much is unclear, but we have a few things to go on to guess what his trade vision is. Workers. Trump has made grand gestures towards supporting U.S. jobs. He's been threatening to get tough on individual corporations that practice offshoring. But just take a look at his whole press blitz about carriers' plans to offshore jobs. If that PR stunt is any indication, he intends to pick out individual offshoring firms, work out a lackluster deal with those firms, claim it's a great deal, and then publicly threaten the local union leaders for saying otherwise. In the case of Carrier, that resulted in this man, who you see on the slide, Chuck Jones, the local union lead, and actually getting death threats, thanks to Trump's Twittered threats. That hardly sounds like a worker-friendly approach to trade. Meanwhile, Trump has advocated for right-to-work laws that disempower unions. He's continued to source his own products from countries that can exploit, where he can exploit low-wage labor. And he's picked a fundamentally anti-union man who opposes raising the minimum wage to be his Secretary of Labor. For the other 3 categories that I've got here, I don't think I need to go into details. On health care, Trump has vowed to help dismantle Obamacare, which would, it's hard to know what's going to replace it, but without a replacement would mean a lack of health insurance for millions. For family farmers, he's not proven to be much of a friend, while he has proven to be a consistent friend to big agribusiness. And on climate, Trump will be the only world leader to not believe in the science of climate change. That includes leaders of countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And he has vowed to undermine core climate protections while appointing ExxonMobil's CEO as the most powerful position in his cabinet. An important additional distinction is that even so far as Trump promotes anyone's interest in the United States beyond corporations, it is their interest at the expense of those of other people in the world. He has shown little concerns for workers' rights abroad, and one of his most flagrant and consistent threats has been to deport millions of immigrants across this country, tearing apart families. So Trump's vision of trade is steeped in the same xenophobia that drove his campaign. What will Trump actually do on trade? It is hard to know, and here I have the details aren't that important, but a guess, one guess, and I think that's the most important takeaway. We don't know. Anyone who pretends like they know exactly what the Trump administration is going to do is fooling you. But there are some indications of some things that will probably are more likely to happen which is to the right, and sooner to happen, which is up. So the upper right-hand corner are things that are most likely. Trump is likely to send a letter saying that he's pulling out of TPP, which would be basically formalizing the work that all of us did to kill that deal, and then, of course, he will claim credit for it. It'll be, but beyond that, the next most likely thing, and the thing I would like to focus on a little bit more, is a NAFTA renegotiation. He's promised to do so, and a lot of inside sources and outside ones believe that he may well actually push ahead with efforts to renegotiate NAFTA. The other things on this slide don't merit going into detail right now, probably, but there are pending trade deals like the Trade and Services Agreement, the China Bilateral Investment Treaty, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that Trump could continue those negotiations and actually try to bring them to conclusion. Some of those actually fall right into Trump's own personal business interests, setting aside all of his anti-trade deal rhetoric on the campaign trail. He could negotiate new bilateral deals. He's strongly advocated for bilateral deals over multilateral ones. So he could pick off the remnants of the TPP and TTIP, that being Japan and the UK, and try to negotiate bilateral deals with them, which would be complicated, but it's possible. He could also impose unilateral tariffs, not as part of any deal, on countries like Mexico and China, as he threatened to do repeatedly during the campaign. The next slide is, I think, the crux of a question that a lot of us are facing, which is, what should our overall approach to Trump be? We're stuck in this situation for the next 4 years, and we have faced a real quandary. Trump has promised to renegotiate NAFTA. That's something we haven't been able to get a president to do, Democratic or Republican, for 2 decades. Seems like a great, or an opportunity we should at least discuss as an opportunity. And yet, Trump's trade vision is, in some ways, in many ways, fundamentally opposed to our own, not to mention his vision for everything else beyond trade. So, 2, I think, essential options, and it's not to say there aren't variations on both of these themes, but do you try to conform to Trump's vision for trade and ask him for items that we like that fit within his own vision, so as to eke out some gains? Or do we clearly state our own vision of putting people and planet before profits, build support for it, more broad public support, and then use Trump's failure to achieve that vision, since he doesn't even share it, to then delegitimize him? Those, I think, I see as 2 essential different strategies going into the Trump administration. Now, the one pro of the left-hand side, the trying to find common ground with Trump on trade, is that you may find some things that a number of us have pushed for could be part of a NAFTA renegotiation, for example. Tighter rules of origin, so as to not allow third-party countries to produce goods without following labor and environmental standards. He may even do something with an investor-state dispute settlement system that all of us hate. It's hard to say, but it's possible you could get some gains. On the flip side, what are the cons of that approach? Well, depending on to what degree you are supporting Trump's vision, or even not explicitly stating support, but saying things that could be construed as support by the press for Trump's vision, you might be forced to become more weakly, if not abandon, certain principles and endorse essentially xenophobic position on trade. That is a concern, but this isn't even so much about purity as it is about pragmatism. If you're going to help push for a NAFTA renegotiation that Trump is in charge of, the Trump administration is in charge of, and that he has to get through the Republican-dominated Congress, it's not likely to be in large part what we want to support. It may have some elements that we have pushed for, but it's likely to have a lot of bad stuff in as well. There's much talk among Republicans who were pro-TPP and among Trump's own cabinet picks that they would be happy to update NAFTA by putting in increased handouts to corporations, including some of the provisions that were in the TPP. That is that they would use a NAFTA renegotiation as kind of a backdoor entry for certain provisions in the TPP. Do you want to be part of pushing for that? In addition, and more broadly, do we want to be giving political capital to Trump? Political capital that will be used against us in all other trade-related areas where we do not see eye to eye at all with the Trump administration. Everything I mentioned on pro-worker provisions and provisions in support of family farmers and our climate and affordable health care. Not to mention all those non-trade related areas where Trump will use increased political capital from a NAFTA renegotiation or from any effort he uses to boost his own status to further his promised attacks on climate protections, on immigrants, on workers, on women, on Muslims, etc. Do we want to be a part of that? Instead, a vision that Sierra Club is supporting, a strategy that Sierra Club is supporting, is to state clearly what we're for and emphasize how it is distinct from Trump. And that includes on trade. And then continue to build broader public support for that vision, tapping the fact that there's an unprecedented rejection of status quo trade models, and use our vision to delegitimize Trump's contrasting vision. I'm going to use a concrete example here, a NAFTA renegotiation. This on the left here, you see a letter that was just put out this last week by the Citizens Trade Campaign, which of course represents a lot of union, family farm, health, and environmental organizations across the country. This, I think, letter is a great letter, and it shows that what I'm suggesting, this approach of sticking to our vision and even more vociferously stating our vision and clearly stating our vision does not mean you pretend like the Trump administration doesn't exist. This is a letter to the Trump administration, in fact. But the letter says, it makes clear what we are for, getting out ahead of Trump and stating the rubric by which any NAFTA renegotiation should be judged. It says, the rubric for assessing a NAFTA renegotiation is clear. Does it put the needs of people and the planet over corporate profits? Does it support, not undermine, good jobs, public health, and a more stable climate? It then goes through and outlines 10 essential changes that we say must be made to NAFTA. And these are largely the same 10 changes that we've been calling for 2 decades, again, to put people and planet ahead of profits. And the letter concludes that, since support for this new approach is at an all-time high, we will redouble our fight for a progressive overhaul of NAFTA while committing to fight against any corporate favoring renegotiation that masquerades as change. So this is essentially putting Trump on notice, being like, you want NAFTA negotiation? Cool. Here, we've been calling for that for 2 decades. Here is the way we will be judging any NAFTA negotiation. We will be pushing hard for a progressive overhaul and pushing equally hard against anything that is actually a corporate overhaul and masquerading as change. And I think that's a great strategy to take with the incoming Trump administration, and one that cannot be easily spun in the press in a way that increases Trump's political capital, and that can be used by us to build greater public support for our vision for a trade overhaul. And then next slide. To conclude, I want to go through just a couple of the points. We as the Sierra Club are using a similar approach to further flesh out what we are for, specifically on the climate piece of a new trade model. This is, of course, just one piece. We believe strongly in a pro-worker, pro-health, pro-family farmer model of trade, and one that is pro-climate. So just after the election, we put out this discussion paper that outlines the contours of what could be included in a new climate-friendly approach to trade. I consulted with about 50 climate and trade specialists in many of your organizations and across the world to ask what should be included. And this is one result. It's not a final position paper. We're still definitely taking input on it, but we want to really have a clear vision, and we hope that this can help towards that end. And it starts with I think a pretty basic premise that to build a new approach to trade that supports, not undermines, climate action, we have to turn the status quo model on its head. That is, uses the simple premise that it is fundamentally at odds with the status quo, which is that trade and investment should be treated as tools for advancing human priorities, not ends in and of themselves. Insofar as trade and investment help us to combat climate change, yay. Insofar as they don't, then those rules should not be included. Next slide. I won't go over all the details given time, but there's basically three broad types of changes that we're proposing here. One is to change trade rules to protect climate policies. That is, trade rules that conflict with climate action should be eliminated so that you don't have to fear being challenged in trade tribunals if you push for stronger climate policies. So we are eliminating ISDS, and we propose replacing it with a completely different system. We are proposing a peace clause that would require the United States, India, and all other actors to stop attacking each other's renewable energy programs at the World Trade Organization. And there's a straightforward carve-out that says basically, insofar as there's trade rules that clash with our climate policies, the climate policies will win. Next slide. The second bucket of policy proposals here is to use trade rules to actually increase our climate protections. That is that trade pacts, in the same way that we believe should happen for workers, they should establish a floor of climate protection among trade partners so that there's not a race to the bottom in climate standards. So that includes, using trade deals to enforce international climate commitments, eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, finance renewable energy, and if a government or corporation fail to live up to these responsibilities, the proposal we're putting forward is that the communities most affected by climate change could seek justice before an independent panel of climate experts. Next slide. And the last one is the one that people actually think of first often, which is how do we actually mitigate the climate impact of trade itself, which we clearly need to do. We believe that we should not be liberating trade in fossil fuels. We actually need to be discouraging trading in fossil fuels. And we should be limiting the climate impacts from shipping. We propose a pretty novel way of doing so in this paper. And we propose a basic border tax so that climate protections in one country don't result in the offshoring of jobs and climate emissions to another country. Next slide. So to wrap up, we're going to continue building support for this. We have plans to do so in specific parts of the country, in the Midwest, and a couple of in the South and the West Coast, to really ramp up a public campaign that will be pushing for a trade reset that adheres to our progressive vision for trade that puts people and planet over profits. And we are committed to really building and working for that over the next 4 years, while we're equally committed to opposing any trade deals that or trade renegotiations that masquerade as change. And next slide. I just want to thank you for, again, approaching this topic, and I look forward to any questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Ben. That gives us a lot to work with. It's kind of scary, all the stuff that's going on now. But if anybody has a question for Ben, please press *6 on your phone, and then when prompted, press 1. We have time for a couple calls. And our first caller is at 206-255.
Thank you. This is Stan Sorsher. I have a question for Ben. Actually, we do know some things about what the Trump administration is going to propose. Peter Navarro has a title of something or another in industrial policy, and they have what they call border adjustments, which, sadly enough, is the expression that was used in the Sierra Club discussion paper to mean something slightly different. But I think it's clear that the Trump administration is going to, everything that we're proposing and they're proposing is going to be a violation of the existing WTO principles, which I think creates a lot of opportunity. So have we compared the things that we know about the Trump proposals with the things that, particularly the Sierra Club discussion paper?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Stan. Thank you. I'd say there's very little alignment between our discussion paper and the things that come out of either any of the three principal the folks on Trump's trade team, those being Wilbur Ross, Peter Navarro, and Robert Lighthizer. Yes, border adjustment in the way that the Republicans have been talking about it is quite different from the carbon duty that we are proposing in our discussion paper. They are proposing, the congressional Republicans are proposing a overhaul of the entire tax system such that goods would be taxed where they're consumed rather than where they're produced. What they essentially mean is that they're going to impose a tax at the border on all imports from all countries. And for anyone who's been looking at trade, you know that a tax at the border is essentially the same thing as a tariff. So they're going to impose a broad-based tariff on all imports from all countries, and then also subsidize exports. And that is part of a broader tax overhaul package. The details are not at all clear, and it very well could violate WTO rules. Not that we would really have a problem with that. But that is fundamentally different from what Sierra Club is proposing is that each country should be doing its own, taking its own initiatives and policies to combat climate change. But if we're restricting, coal and gas because of climate emissions in one country, we don't want those companies, manufacturing companies, to just offshore jobs to another country where they don't have those climate protections, taking not only jobs with them, but also their emissions with them, which would undercut the utility of our climate protections. So one way to getting around that is by taxing imports from countries that have been historically high climate change polluters, but who are not doing a lot right now to combat climate change. That also that helps to prevent job and emissions offshoring. It also creates an incentive for our trade partners to increase their climate protections. So two pretty different proposals. Both could well incite WTO cases, so they do have that in common. And I think our positionality with regard to the WTO being screw the WTO, let's do what's best for our own purposes is probably something a parallel position. But I would say what's best for our purposes, according to what we in the Sierra Club and what many of us are proposing, is best for workers and the climate and around the world. Whereas what the Republican proposal thus far is, I would say, a much narrower in scope, best for a select few in one country.
Great. Thanks very much. That was a great answer. Next speaker.
I want to ask Ben about TISA and how likely that is to sort of sneak up on us, because I believe a fair amount of it has already been negotiated, and it just concerns me that it's been under the radar. Most of us have not focused much on it, but I think it's pretty bad. How vigilant should we be about focusing on that as opposed to the new trade policy that you're promoting, or we should just be doing both?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think first on how quickly TISA will be coming up, yes, you're right. I think it's undergone something like 15 rounds of negotiations at this point, so it's at a really advanced stage. And yes, it is a very concerning deal. From leaks have been able to see what's in it. But with regards to the environment, for example, it has provisions in there that would make it much more difficult to restrict fracking, for example. It's a trade and services agreement, and almost everything in energy is actually a service. And so essentially what this deal is trying to do is restrict what governments can do with regard to regulating energy. And that's the name of the game when it comes to climate change, is regulating energy. So we're very concerned about TISA. And I think it is incumbent on all of us to look into it. I don't think it's an either-or thing between TISA and proposing a new trade model. I think a new trade model is getting our ideas solidified, getting them very clearly expressed, and promulgating them, putting them out there so as to build support for them. And actually, when deals come along like a TISA or a NAFTA renegotiation, that provides an opportunity for us to say what we are for and contrast it with what we're against. And within the case of TISA, what we're against is baked into that deal. I don't think there's any going back. Trump may well, it's hard to say what Trump will do, but a number of people have speculated that Trump may be a big fan of TISA. It doesn't really have, while it does affect manufacturing, most people don't know that, and like you said, it's been flowing below the radar, so he could avoid incurring very many political costs by supporting this deal, and could help a lot of his business friends in doing so. And so it's quite possible we would see a Trump continuation of the TISA negotiations. And yes, we should use that as an opportunity to try to stop the forward movement of TISA, and to use that as simultaneously as an opportunity to state what we are for in a new trade vision.
Great, thanks. We have time for one more question. And this is for Rachel Maycliff.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, your line is open. Go ahead.
Okay. I have many good friends who would go along with everything that Ben said, except when we were kids in college, we were told over and over again that trade agreements will raise wages of workers throughout the world. In making our arguments, is there some data that could be collected to show, to predict that wages of workers around the world will not be adversely affected if the kind of trade that we want will be implemented?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, that data has been collected, I'd say, over the last, the one good thing about the NAFTA model of trade is that we've had it now for 20-odd years. And so we've been able to see its results. And yes, the data has been collected, and it shows that when you pit workers in one country against workers in another country, the end result is it's not the workers who win. It is the corporations who are able to easily offshore their jobs from country to country, looking for the lowest labor standards and the lowest wages. In the same way, like I lived in Nicaragua for 3 years, and there, there was a Central America trade agreement that was being negotiated at the time I was living there, and lots of the businesses said this is going to help workers because it's going to bring jobs, it's going to raise wages because there'll be more jobs, and workers will be able to negotiate for higher wages. And so many of these jobs actually, ironically, were coming from Mexico because Nicaraguan wages were below Mexican wages and Nicaraguan labor standards were below Mexican labor standards, so they were leaving Mexico. Well, Mexico had been promised exactly the same thing under NAFTA, that it was going to bring jobs and bring higher wages. Well, now that was no longer true because largely they were going to China, but some of them were also going to Central America. By the time I left Nicaragua, those jobs that had been promised had already started leaving Nicaragua because they were going to Vietnam and Bangladesh. Because Nicaragua, as it turns out, was not the bottom of the barrel for workers' rights or wages either. And so it doesn't benefit workers anywhere to have a system in place where borders are so porous that corporations, and corporations alone, people cannot. Corporations can traverse those borders, are going around the world looking for the bottom of the barrel, whatever's cheapest for them, making it very hard to organize, making it very hard for workers to have any leverage to negotiate for higher wages or higher working standards. So that theoretical argument is backed up by empirical data that has been assembled over a couple of decades, and you can look at Center for Economic and Policy Research or Economic Policy Institute, a variety of think tanks that have been compiling such data, and definitely a pro-worker model of trade would not be the one we've had. It really does require an alternative.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. We're going to clear and we want to thank you very much, Ben. We really appreciate your coming on tonight. You had the benefit of being the first speaker, and we know you do have a lot of other commitments, so we hope that you will accept our invitation for future calls. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you. We are now going to introduce Michael Stumo. Michael, are you with us?
I'm here.
Okay, well, that's very good. I'm glad to hear that. I think we went a little long for Robert Kuttner, so we're very pleased to introduce Michael Stumo. Let me just go down to your slides here. Michael Stumo is the Chief Executive Officer of the Coalition for a Prosperous America, a coalition of agriculture, manufacturing, and organized labor associations, companies, and individuals. CPA works for policies to balance U.S. trade, maintain U.S. sovereignty, and to protect jobs, growth, and prosperity. CPA represents the interests of over 2.7 million people through its association and company members. Michael has a Bachelor of Science from Iowa State University in Agriculture and a law degree from the University of Iowa, graduating from both institutions with high distinction. He is a member of the bars of Massachusetts, Nebraska, and Connecticut, and he is an author of law review articles and the editor of a policy book entitled A Food and Agricultural Policy for the 21st Century. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll probably have to leave just after I talk because I actually have someone in the hospital here. So
I'm sorry to hear that.
I won't be able to hang around.
All right. Thank
you. Yeah, the point of my talk really is, of course, CPA deals more with the economics of trade and in U.S. jobs and growing our economy, and so. The point of my talk is that there is, from that perspective, we do see some overlap with the Trump administration. At least, there's many factions within it. But we do see, with the fast track debate, we saw, and part of our value add was to help get some of the far right opposed to trade deals on more sovereignty and economic nationalist bases to add to what the progressives have done to solidify the Democratic vote on the House side. We saw with the election itself, the biggest of all the demographic exit poll data, the biggest move was a white working class vote more to the Republican side, the Trump side. As much as the race, gender, and sexual orientation debate occurred in the debate, in the campaign, the demographics didn't shift enough of those to Clinton, more single digits, to overcome the double-digit shift of the working class, especially between the coasts. There you can see, the vote map by state, but if you go to the next slide, you see the vote map by county, which shows many of you have seen this, but it's an awful lot of red, even in the blue states. It was very much an urban for Clinton, red for Trump. And the next slide shows a little bit more, which is, the majorities, big majorities by Clinton in the cities. And then the next slide shows where things move from 2012 to 2016 for the, moved a lot more, as opposed to Romney, it moved a lot more for Trump in those red areas, including those swing states. And, of course, we saw in the House side, in the Senate, the governorships and the state legislatures, the progressive side didn't have a message that sort of worked very well. And from the trade agreement side, the trade and jobs was a really big deal, a consistent theme that that Trump made in every one of his speeches. Of course, Clinton did a flip on it. People weren't really sure, and there's a lot of talk in the Dem side that automation is going to take all the jobs away. They're just not coming back. Not from this group, but from the New York Times and a lot of some of the more progressive side. So this flyer actually is something we circulated in the House after the election, And we are actually, from our organizational perspective, we want to hold Trump to his campaign promises on trade so he doesn't backslide with more of the establishment Republicans that want the trade deals, and also showing where there's some parallelism to the Democrats' trade principles, either spoken by the Congressional Progressive Caucus or Sandy Levin. This isn't saying that there's agreement on everything. It's showing that there is some agreement in some ways. From our perspective, if we can hold Trump to his campaign promises and help build the right-wing support to keep it there, that's as good as we can hope for in the next 4 years, rather than backsliding, because the Democratic side is in such a minority. And so to split the Republicans and keep the Democrats as solid as possible in the House, and maybe even expanding that to the Senate, in our view, is a good way to go. But in that first slide, that we don't need to go back to it. But I noted, I read every day the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and then the Daily Kos, the left-wing blog, and Breitbart, the alt-right, sort of blog paper. And there was more anti-trade, consistently anti-trade agreement articles in Breitbart than there was in Daily Kos, which was an awful lot of neoliberal support that we just all need to get educated and have more trade deals, and it's good for everybody. So there is the working class, as many of you know, has shifted from the Democrats to the Republican side. I know Public Citizen's poll in the fall on trade showed more support for trade deals in the TPP among Democratic voters than among Republican voters. So there's a big shift here. People are economically uncertain. There's a lot of things going on in the election, but the economic uncertainty had a big piece of it. Next slide, please. So before we get to this, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Trump's trade people. Wilbur Ross has been kind of on both sides of the issue. He's the Secretary of Commerce nominee. More recently, he's been pretty strong in an anti-trade agreement view, but of course has been the other way in the past. In fact, he has supported TPP in the past. So he would go either way. And it seems to me the Trump administration is probably going to be a little bit different in that they're going to delegate more to the agencies as opposed to being so centrally controlled from the White House. Time will tell, but you see a lot of in the cabinet nominee hearings, you see a lot of divergence from Trump on several issues. You don't see a lot of pushback, and it seems consistent with how he ran his organizations, as he picked people and then let them do things and then kind of did his own thing as well. So we may see the agencies diverge from Trump under that sort of delegating role without the central control. Time will tell. Peter Navarro, the head of the new National Trade Council, is pretty strong, mostly from an economic nationalist side, of course not from a lot of other issues among the fair trade movement. But if our view is, of course, CPA comes from the economic side, but if you put together the non-economic issues, the human rights issues, the climate, and the rest from the fair trade movement, among the economic issues too, with the economic issues of the right, which if you look at a Navarro view, basically the core view is trade deals. First, trade deals are not trade policy. They're a subset of it. So there's going to be some unilateral stuff going on possibly as well. But if it creates net jobs, increases manufacturing, and grows GDP, those are probably the best case scenario Trump trade policy there would be. And under that rubric, if you continue with trade deficits and offshoring, it doesn't fit. Bob Lighthizer at USTR, we'll see what kind of authority he has, because Ross is supposed to be the boss on trade according to Trump. He, of course, is big on the enforcement in more of a legalistic way. To what extent he uses enforcement to, in an aggressive way to either defend what U.S. rights are under the agreements that other countries have signed, or in fact to challenge things and maybe even provide a weakening of the WTO. That remains to be seen. Now, as to this slide, these are some economic overlap issues with the right, with actually the Steve Bannon wing of the factions within the Trump administration, as opposed to the Mike Pence wing. And these messages work for far-right conservatives, Tea Party conservatives, constitutional conservatives, and the like, which were key to building Republican opposition to fast track from 9 to 15 who voted against the trade deals in 2011 for Korea and Colombia to 54 against in fast track vote to probably 75 to 80 against in TPP. So you need them too, and what do we say to them? So there's the America First stuff, which actually plays well with overlap on the economic issues, which is the trade deficit is bad for the country. It's offshoring the like, and balancing trade is the way to do it. And trade deals don't do a very good job of that. In many cases, they take us the other way. Jobs. Big campaign theme, big conservative theme, and of course a big progressive theme. Wages again. So the things like cool, food safety, investor-state dispute settlement, WTO, overlords overruling our laws. Those are big issues in the fair trade movement, but they're also massively big issues among the right wing on sovereignty grounds, the kitchen table issues of food safety, unsafe foreign food. Those do not cut along party lines well. But sovereignty, even among several Republican senators that would have voted for TPP and voted for fast track, and on the House side too, there's a lot of increased concern on the sovereignty issue, and a little more push there changes the game. The fair trade movement is concerned about corporate power and multinational corporatism, but the conservative analog is crony capitalism. Every time you say crony capitalism, heads nod, they get it. Also, there's a helpful part, where this whole neoliberal agenda that Ben Beachy talked about before, which has been supported by whether it's Brookings or Harvard or even on the other side, Cato and Heritage. They're all part of that neoliberal agenda. Borderless world for the conservatives is a horrible thing, but there's an anti-establishment, anti-elite, anti-globalism that you've all seen, which is very strong, which they don't believe the Jeffrey Sachs anymore. They don't believe the Larry Summers. They don't believe the Greg Mankiws, all the sort of economic royalty of the Bushes and the Clintons. And that's a good thing, and that's a big value add for our movement as well. And of course, the fair traders are often, more pro-local and the like. So even as there are profound differences between the, conservative economic nationalists and the fair traders, there are these issues of agreement and with different language and without bolstering that on both sides to keep the Democratic side a majority against the trade deals that are the old style, and significantly fracturing the Republicans who've just seen the Bush royalty taken down, as well as a bunch of their other preferred candidates in the primaries. They're looking around, what does this new world look like? We're in a pretty strong position, and again, our view at CPA is we want to try to hold Trump to his campaign promises. We think that's the best we can do for about 4 years, and rightly or wrongly. And in fact, sometimes we'll even defend Navarro, for example, against attacks by the Heritage Foundation, who say they're full of baloney and we just need to have more, trade deals and we'll all be better off. So that's my report.
Great. Michael, do you have time for a question or two?
Yeah, I can take a couple questions now. Thank you.
I know we were going to group you with Steve, but since you're in a rush, if anybody has a question for Michael Stumo, press *6 on your phone and 1 when prompted. We only have time for 1 or 2. Okay. All right. Our first is Stan Boyd. Stan, I believe your line. Yes.
All right. So your position seems to be different than Ben Beachy's. It seemed like Ben Beachy was saying we should really put out a progressive approach and fight for that, even if it's going to come into opposition with both Trump and the Republicans. Yours seems to be, let's be practical, let's do what's possible, like we did with the fight against the fast track. And you raise a lot of points where we might be able to utilize them to at least get rid of the USDS and increase emphasis on our own judicial system in making decisions rather than putting it in the hands of corporations through the international tribunals. Is that correct?
Yeah, but I think they're synergistic because to the extent, for example, if you're just thinking about climate, which I know Ben is thinking beyond that, but certainly predominantly about climate and the environment, there's 535 legislators. They're not all going to vote in the same way, and there's quite a few of them that would be neoliberal free traders but are concerned about climate. And climate would be the reason to oppose a retread trade deal. So this does not dismiss anything that Ben said, and anything where more progressive or environmental folks. We've got to have all the votes to keep a coalition together to stop the new bilaterals. It's a big risk, a new U.S.-Japan agreement, which would be just a retread of some of the past ones, or a U.S.-UK one. Those are real risks. The Trump administration is against multilateral, but maybe open to bilaterals. So, but what I'm saying here is don't dismiss. And from where CPA is, because of our economic focus, we actually have a lot more collaborative ability with the right, the economic nationalists. But you got to keep the folks that are concerned about climate and the environment and, human rights strong, because we can't lose those votes either.
Right. Thanks.
Great. Thanks. We have time for one more question.
Okay. So
hi, Joyce.
Hi. Thanks so much. So my question is, okay, I'm in California in the Bay Area. And, we were kind of thinking going for fair trade versus free trade. But, however, that doesn't even work with a lot of the so-called liberal congressionals. But what I'm wondering from you is, I'd like to have a slogan. And is there a slogan that would work for both? Or is it better to try to, have a slogan that works for the more liberal side? I'm not calling it progressive at this point, and the the right wing side that we want to get to. One slogan or two slogans?
Well, I think it's two, actually, but I'm not saying that I'm right or that I'm right forever. But they're very different. But there is the, when the middle of the country voted, a little more democratic, there's a strong economic populism, Midwest economic populism. I actually grew up with that in an Iowa hog farm. which has sort of been lost. I mean, Elizabeth Warren picked it up a little bit, but sovereignty is something that works with the left and the right. But I think the big issue these days, and I think it's and I've said it before, it's an economic carpet bombing of the country between the coasts with these trade deals. Jobs and wages. To the extent that you can fit what you're already doing and keeping your supporters with you, but increase being able to talk about jobs and wages in this country, I think it's important electorally and for this fight too. So, that's...
And what about Silicon Valley, which is actually where I am? If you have anything on that.
Well, I think it's a loser to say, Trump saying, I'm keeping jobs here and plants are building here, and to say, oh, it's not, it's a big fib. Sometimes it kind of is, but boy, it's a real hard road to hoe, and there is a kind of a change, going on there. The Silicon Valley folks are, to the conservative, they're traitors to America because they're inventing things and manufacturing them somewhere else, and they're not benefiting U.S. workers. Mm-hmm. I know Silicon Valley just wrote a letter, Oracle and others, complaining about, for example, China not playing fair with them, not letting them in, not abiding by their WTO commitments. So what's the use? That's a little bit of movement where they kind of were sort of these libertarians. We don't need everybody, anybody. We'll just harvest the government-sponsored research and then pretend we did it ourselves, and go global. But I don't have I don't have any special knowledge of Silicon Valley right now.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So thank you so much, Michael, and we'll hopefully get you on another call. Thank you. I would now like to welcome Dr. Steve Supan. He is a senior policy analyst at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, IATP, a nonprofit, non-governmental organization where he has worked since 1994. Steve researches and submits regulatory comments on trade, agriculture, commodity markets, food safety, and environmental health issues. He is the U.S. co-chair of the Food Policy Committee of the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, TACD, an alliance of about 65 U.S. and European consumer organizations. And they meet with U.S. and European Commission officials to discuss TACD resolutions. Steve represents IATP at Americans for Financial Reform. He has traveled to 38 countries to explain U.S. trade related to agricultural, agro-environmental, and food safety policy and practice. His December 2016 blogs include Undocumented Workers in the U.S. Agribusiness Economic Model and Protectionism and U.S. Farm Profitability. Welcome, Steve.
So Michael has already shown the data from the election. So you have about 2/3 of rural voters voting for Trump, but maybe more importantly, voting for the Republican Party. And this is a pretty deep-seated vote, and one where basically the Republican Party is promising salvation to farmers through more exports. The Democratic National Committee did not have an agricultural platform. There were a few, I think a paragraph or so on rural development, but rural development did not get funded in the Farm Bill. And it's always been a real hard push to get any serious agricultural policy that does not have to do with commodity production and trade. So I'm going to start out here, just going to do kind of a three-part talk. First, a little bit of agricultural trade policy history, major concepts, and then I want you to see some agricultural economic data so that you understand the plight of U.S. farmers, why for them every environmental rule, every food safety rule is just another cost when they are already underwater. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about what is to be done. So in the WTO and in the so-called free trade agreements, there's a concept called aggregate measures of support, and it's assumed that these aggregate measures of support are always potentially trade distorting. And if you're a small country, you have a very big task because of the retaliatory powers of larger governments, especially the United States. In the agriculture agreement at the WTO, unlike in the industrial agreements, there are no rules against dumping agricultural products. That is, no rules against dumping products at below the price, the cost of production. And therefore, you can't apply countervailing duties to offset those below cost of production products. Also guilty until proven innocent are all environmental health and safety rules. They all must be least trade restrictive, and they face very steep challenges, very complicated bureaucratic procedures in order to demonstrate that those rules are not least trade restrictive. Something that's maybe not so well understood is that the most important export that the United States makes is its regulatory system, or rather the deregulatory system. And so I'm just using one example here for genetically modified organisms and now for synthetically modified organisms. When you have a regulatory application package to commercialize them, well over half of the information is classified by the companies as confidential business information. So you really have no idea about what the underlying science is of the so-called safety, and indeed FDA and the USDA do not make affirmative claims of safety. They merely state in their letters that they understand that the applicant believes that the products are safe. Finally, another basic pillar of the unsustainability and injustice in trade policy is that there's no hard law protection for agricultural labor or for the environment, and this means that they are always costs to be, as they say in the trade economics or in economics generally, to be externalized, that is, to be ignored. Next slide, please. This is a sample of the unsustainability of a particular kind of agricultural trade. This is dairy exporting and the dairy industry. This is just a chart about the physical dumping of raw milk on a monthly basis in Northeast U.S. dairies, which is among the smallest dairy sector. And there you can see that between 5 and 9 million gallons of milk are dumped each month in the northeastern dairies. This is, of course, not only a huge waste of food, but it is also an environmental disaster because you've had all of these inputs with, agricultural runoff, use of pesticides and fertilizers. All of those natural resources are thrown out, really, along with this milk that's dumped. In the major dairy states of California and Wisconsin, we're talking about a far, far higher percentage, or many more millions of gallons of milk that are dumped into high-tech sewers. Next slide, please. In the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations to the dumping of raw milk was to attack the supply management program of Canada, which was designed to increase dairy prices for farmers and to reduce any kind of physical dumping of milk. And what the TPP did here, you have in the light blue line, dairy imports to the United States from 2010 through 2014. And then in the dark blue line, you have the USDA's dairy import projection under the TTIP tariff rules and tariff description rules, and the red line is anticipated dairy imports under a non-TTIP scenario. So here you've got hundreds of millions of gallons of milk being dumped in the United States, and instead TPP would increase the import of milk protein concentrate, which is a low-protein form of milk exported chiefly by New Zealand, but also by other countries. And it's imported for the benefit of Dean Foods and Kraft to make something called processed cheese. I mean, cheese-like products. And there are other dairy ingredients, too, that essentially drive raw milk producers out of business. Next slide, please. So this is what Congress reads about agricultural trade. They just see up, 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 U.S. agricultural trade in billions of dollars. And, of course, imports are going up, 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 too. Depending on how you read the statistics, either there's a slight trade deficit or a slight trade surplus in agricultural trade. But more importantly are the unsustainability and injustice aspects of this very peculiar form of trade. Next slide, please. Okay, so what you see, what Congress saw in that Congressional Research Service report is, the assumption is that farmers receive this export value. And this is something they definitely do not do. So if you were to read this chart as a member of Congress, you would say, oh my, our farmers get 30% of their income from exports, or somewhere between 20 and 30% between 1975 and 2015. But in fact, what farmers do and what ranchers do and what horticulturalists do is they sell their raw agricultural product to elevators or to stockyards or to vegetable wholesalers who are buying this product in most years at below the cost of production. Next slide, please. So here's USDA's cost of production figures and profit estimates for corn, soybeans, and wheat. These are among the three most exported U.S. row crops, and I've highlighted in yellow the per bushel loss in parentheses there, for example, and then the per acre profit loss when you look at the cost of production versus the price they receive. And I should add that the price that the USDA quotes is not the elevator price, or the stockyard price. It's the commodity futures price. Those prices, for example, in the Chicago Board of Trade, are higher than what they would receive at their local elevators, their stockyards, or vegetable wholesaler. So, for example, every time you plant soybeans, you're losing $2 per bushel. You're losing $90 or $91 per acre. And this results in windfall profits for traders. But, next slide, please. But without subsidies, these farmers would be out of business. I shouldn't have used the same slide, but essentially you cannot farm year in and year out without subsidies from the government. And these are the subsidies that the U.S. Trade Representative attacks when other countries use them. Next slide, please. So in 2003, IATP did a report on agricultural export dumping in the 10 years after the founding of the WTO. And just for example, here in the bottom line that I've highlighted in yellow, it may be difficult to see, I don't know, on your screens, but for wheat, which is a widely exported U.S. agricultural product, the full cost of production of wheat was $5.63 a bushel, and the export price, that is the export price taking into account transportation, insurance, shipping, handling, was $4.04 per bushel, and that meant that 28% of the price of wheat was dumped. If the WTO had an agricultural export discipline, other countries, if they wished, could apply that. They could apply that anti-dumping duty, because for those countries that had their own wheat growing program, that dumped wheat would put their farmers out of business. And as a result, over the years, we've had an increasing number of former farmers from various countries migrating either to Europe or to the United States or to nearby countries. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the agricultural migrant issue shortly. Next slide, please. So the result of this long-term tendency of trying to have an agricultural policy that's driven to trade to export at below the cost of production is that only about 10% of farmers depend primarily on farm income to survive. Now, the USDA definition of income includes government payments, and so in this first column, the first column includes all farms, and you can see it's about 10% of those farmers get their income from farm income. 90% of it depends on off-farm jobs, trucking, working in factories, a long list of occupations. The exception to that rule are the mega farms, because they are getting huge government subsidies, because the subsidies are for the most part determined in terms of acreage and in terms of yield on a per acre basis. And I really don't have time to get into the complexities of this, but when you go to rural towns, you'll see a lot of empty storefronts because the income is just flowing out of those towns and into agribusiness centers, into the Chicago Board of Trade, and then you have a very small percentage of farmers who are selling well over $1 million in sales. Those are the ones that are prospering in this trade-dependent or trade-driven and unsustainable agriculture system. Next slide, please. So, but to get a better sense of the total kind of food value chain here, the farmers really make up a pretty small part of this overall food chain. I guess it would be better if this dollar were vertical. But on the far left, you have the farm production portion of the USDA food dollar, which is about 10%. Everything after that are different forms of, food processing, 15%, food delivery service, which includes restaurants and so on and so forth, retail food around 13%. In other words, these are the services that in the trade in services agreement they call services incidental to food and agriculture. And this is where the lion's share of the profit, and this is where the lion's share of the Trump administration negotiating power is going to be focused. A lot of the bilateral tariff issues are really forum shifting because the TPP, the NAFTA, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, people that he has hired are going to basically be divvying up their tariff profiles and rebranding their maximize export at all cost policies under bilateral names. Next slide, please. So there is a agribusiness or farm labor crisis. This is as it has been identified by the American Farm Bureau Federation, which is a federation started by the USDA to counter populist farm movements at the beginning of the 20th century. And the Farm Bureau is desperate to convince the Trump administration to provide some kind of temporary agriculture worker visa because, and I don't know if you can see this data down below, but very conservatively estimated, more than 500,000 undocumented workers, more than 1 million foreign workers form the large share of the agribusiness on-farm labor base. And the mega dairies, confined animal feed operations for beef, mega horticultural farms all depend on this labor, but they can't if the labor is choked off by the promise of the Trump administration to deport. Well, I guess now he's come down from 11 million to 2 or 3 million. Obviously, agribusiness will be ruined, so they'll be the Trump administration is going to be negotiating with the Farm Bureau and big agriculture on some kind of visa program, which, however, will not grant citizenship to these workers. Next slide. So here's a few of the Trump policy tea leaves. What happens before 2018 is going to be very different from what happens after 2018. 2018 elections are crucial because of the census and the redistricting, the savage gerrymandering that will occur after 2018 if the Republicans win again. As Ben said, as Mike said, there's going to be more trade enforcement. But the Chinese aggregate measures of support very much imitate the U.S. aggregate measures of support. And so there's going to be a ferocious fight. You have steel dumping disciplines. You can apply countervailing duties, but you can't do that in agriculture. So this is going to be a ferocious dispute, and it will affect a lot of trade law, especially because the United States isn't in the position of constantly redefining their subsidies as emergency subsidies, then not subject to WTO disciplines. As has already been stated, there's going to be these withdrawals from NAFTA and the TPP. I personally think this is forum shifting. If you have bilateral tariff-only negotiations, these are all NAFTA, TPP, and TTIP proponents. It's difficult to believe that they are actually going to change their policy. And one thing that I very much doubt they will change is the negotiations in secrecy package or practice with corporate lobbyists. But this, and then as both Michael and Ben mentioned, there's going to be a lot of self-congratulatory tours for these kind of gestures towards saving U.S. jobs. This temporary agricultural visa program without a path to citizenship, this is something on which everybody should campaign because essentially what the Farm Bureau is proposing is an updated version of a very old program called the Braceros program from 1948 to 1962, which was scandalous in the way that it treated workers. I have a couple policy proposals regarding that. I am quite certain that the Trump administration will try to finalize and pass the TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, and it will try to approve a rebranded TPP and TTIP. Next slide, please. So now we're in the what is to be done section. Right now, the House is considering 4 savagely anti-regulatory bills. The Coalition for Sensible Safeguards is leading the charge against these. Essentially, these bills, which include the regulatory, these are terribly named bills, the Regulatory Accountability Act, Regulations in Need of Scrutiny Act, other kind of euphemisms, these would essentially make it impossible to regulate. And this would be the position that the United States would be trying to export in its trade policy, because the floor would be to have these, well, at least 80 new procedural hurdles to develop regulations to protect environment, safety, health, workers, consumer goods, and so on and so forth. When Trump is negotiating this agricultural visa program, we must demand the path to citizenship, the right to organize in labor unions in any agricultural visa program. This, with the incoming labor secretary, is going to be a non-starter, and we can make a lot of noise about the hypocrisy. I hate to even use the word hypocrisy. It's just that they're going to have an unsustainable labor program that's going to violate human rights. In the NAFTA renegotiation, we can campaign for the ratification of the International Labor Organization Agriculture Labor Convention. The United States is notorious for not signing any of the United Nations related conventions, not even the Convention against Child Labor. And we have to demand an agricultural anti-dumping clause in an NAFTA renegotiation, because more dumping of U.S. agricultural products into Mexico is certainly going to produce more waves of former farmers who are going to be crossing illegally into the United States or coming as indentured servants for a short time under this Farm Bureau proposed temporary ag visa program. We have to campaign for timely disclosure of all draft trade investment negotiation documents, including meeting notes with lobbyists and along, etc. Here we need to use the Freedom of Information Act as long as it still is on the books. And here's something, this is kind of one of my favorite things to do, is right now the the trade agreements can only be voted on after the U.S. International Trade Commission does assessments, but the assessments they do are only in terms of the corporation's benefits, and there's in the law, the Trade Priority Act, it certainly can be interpreted that there should be public health, environmental health impact assessments of these agreements. Next and last slide, please. Another thing that for people who are interested in working on the trade in services agreement, there are sections on food and agricultural services, but these chapters include no protections for public health, for environmental health, or for public service protections, such as for school lunch programs. Right? The Trump administration is going to go attacking both the U.S. Public school lunch and breakfast programs, but they will certainly attack other programs in other countries as violating their right to export to those programs. A lot of trade policy is conducted in the Farm Bill. It is almost certain, in my view, the Trump administration will wait until after the 2018 elections to negotiate the Farm Bill, because all of its contradictions are going to become apparent if it tries to negotiate during the 2018 elections. But for the 2019 Farm Bill, we must demand supply management. Every other industrial sector has when you produce too much, you control your supply to improve farm gate prices. One of the benefits of supply management is it's fiscally conservative. Very conservatively, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that will be at least $10 billion in fiscal year 2017 that will go to compensate for market failure in the agricultural commodity programs. We have to require that USDA include all labor costs in the cost of production calculations. Right now, they exclude labor costs, especially in dairy. We have to demand that you base your subsidy payments not just on crop yield and acreage, but on good agricultural practices that are environmentally sustainable. And as Ben mentioned, we need to phase out the investor-state dispute settlement from all U.S. so-called free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties, because no foreign corporation or foreign subsidiary of a U.S. corporation should have more rights than a U.S. company. Our public judiciary system is at least has some transparency. It has precedent setting. It has some jurisprudential features that are completely lacking in the dark rooms of the ISDS, where you could be a trade lawyer one day, a complainant, and the next day you can be a judge. I mean, it's completely a bizarre system. And last but not least, we want to campaign to defeat rebranded business-as-usual trade agreements and the Farm Bill. A lot of this fight is going to be about somehow figuring out to counter the messaging, the victory tours, and so on and so forth that are going to be passed off as trade policy change. Okay? So next and last slide is just some resources that I'd like to draw your attention to from the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and as this is recorded, then you'll be able to access those resources. Thanks a lot for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Great, Steve. That was a lot of information, and everybody, we do post these PowerPoints on our Facebook group, Trade Justice Alliance on Facebook, so you'll be able to get it there. And if you have a question for Steve, press *6 on your phone. We can only take a few questions. Press *6 and then 1 when prompted. So we'll start with the first question. I see 585259.
Like Harriet has alluded, it's a lot of information. And one of the things that you said, which is of particular concern, is we have to convince the Trump administration. To try to convince the Trump administration of anything at this point would involve momentum and activist understanding. So given that, given those two conditions, what would be the message that we should encourage through activism in the most simple and concise way that will produce effectiveness down the road?
Well, I think if you understand agricultural export dumping and the damage that it does to farms and agricultural and natural resources, you know, they're going to have anti-dumping against steel. Lighthizer is a specialist in anti-dumping against steel, and you basically say no U.S. agricultural export dumping and establish trade disciplines against agricultural export dumping. That's a pretty simple message. Maybe a little more complicated message because trade, some trade policy advocates don't do a lot of work in supply management, but if you do decide to work on the Farm Bill, you have to have supply management in order to reduce, to improve the terribly low prices that make rural America so angry and that make them so vulnerable to Trump's message.
Thank you very much. Okay. Caller at 530-758. Don, your line is open.
Okay, so this is Nancy Price. Thank you very much.
Oh, hi, Nancy.
Hi.
Thank you.
So, wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask, I guess, two very brief questions. First of all, we've got to be able to have some materials that explain very clearly but simply some of what you presented, especially about the anti-dumping. And I want to say that for the first time, I really understand that subsidies being based on acreage mean that we have more GMOs and more pesticides and herbicides harmful to health and environment. But in any case, I think we need some really clear materials because I could not sit down and explain this to somebody at this point in my understanding, I don't think. But secondly, what are we going to do about the big mergers here? For example, Syngenta and is it Syngenta and Monsanto, or Bayer and Monsanto, where we're seeing this huge Bayer, where we're seeing this huge consolidation of some of the major GMO seed, pesticide, herbicide companies. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nancy. So what ITP did back in 2003, and what I'm pretty certain we'll do with our new dumping study, is we made a kind of accordion pamphlet, something that can fit in your pocket. And at the Hong Kong Ministerial in 2003, this was the most popular piece of literature. A lot of a lot of negotiators who were opposed to U.S. agribusiness dumping, actually had this in their front pockets. They would walk into negotiation with it. I think a lot, I think a lot of campaigning needs to be directed toward, meetings with farmers, talking with, National Farmers Union, National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, to get a sense of just how tough their situation is, and then how easy it is for not just the Trump administration, but the Obama administration to, trot out these econometric projections where they say exports are going to save you. Well, it's not exports it's just the public subsidies. And what's happening though is we're exhausting our natural resource base. Our soil is going down the Mississippi River. We're overusing our water supply. We actually have to reduce our trade, and that's a hard message. On the agribusiness mergers is really quite frightening, and it's how can I say, it's ironic in the least that you have all of this chest thumping about China, right? And then you've got the House Ag Committee. They're all ready to sign off on the Kim China Syngenta merger. They don't really care about what the impact of that is going to be on U.S. agriculture, because they just buy the line that bigger is more efficient and more better, and they're going to feed the world. They don't feed the world. I mean, they may force feed the world, but they definitely don't feed the world. It's hard to predict what is going to happen with these mergers. There is a group in Canada called the Etc. Group, which produces excellent literature on these mergers, why they shouldn't go through. There's an antitrust institute in Washington, D.C. I think it's always useful to point out that the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Justice Department basically have not enforced the law that pertains to agribusiness mergers for 40 years now. The Inspector General at USDA has said that, and I think there is some campaigning to be done to prevent those mergers, because once they get locked in, then it makes it so much more difficult to negotiate anything sustainable or just for agriculture, because basically you'll have these. Right now, Trump has already met with Monsanto and Bayer, and he's going completely out of channels. He's basically doing this sort of one-on-one and not looking at the business practices of these companies, or what the merger would mean for loss of choice of agricultural inputs, and just this increasingly chemically intensive, environmentally unsustainable agriculture that is subsidized by the public because the market refused to pay the prices of cost production plus for those commodities.
Wow.
But we are going to work on some simple anti-dumping materials. I can assure you of that. But do look at the Etc. Group, etcgroup.org, for materials on the ag-biz mergers.
Could you say that again, the name of the group?
etcgroup.org.
That's going to do it for questions for Steve. Thank you so much, Steve. That was very informative. And as I said, we will make these materials available for everyone. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're moving on to the activist portion of the webinar. Dr. Margaret Flowers is co-director for Popular Resistance and Trade for People and the Planet, formerly Flush the TPP. Margaret co-hosts Clearing the Fog Radio, broadcasting on We Act Radio, 1480 AM in Washington, D.C. She is trained as a pediatrician at Johns Hopkins and has a long history in the single-payer movement. And Margaret has appeared on Bill Moyer's Journal, Democracy Now! And Fox Business News, as well as many local and international media outlets and documentaries. Margaret has been an organizer against the TPP for years and was also a Green Party candidate for U.S. Senate from Maryland. And her organizations are Popular Resistance and Trade for People and the Planet. Go, Margaret.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on the call, and thanks to all who have stayed on this long. So I'm going to run through a little bit about the Disrupt J20 events that are being put together by a collective of D.C. Experienced organizers, and we joined that effort with Trade Justice Alliance to do a trade justice contingent. But right now the action camp is going on. They had 2 full days, yesterday and today, at American University, and tomorrow is the last day of the action camp. It's free and open to people that are involved, that are going to participate in Disrupt J20. I think tomorrow is mostly going to focus on legal trainings and direct action techniques and things of that nature. Then if you want to go to the next slide, January 17th through the 19th, so Tuesday through Thursday, they will have a convergence space at St. Stephen's Church, and we'll be there on Tuesday during the day to do our art build for the trade justice contingent. They are working with Seeds of Peace, who's providing free meals, and then people can also sleep over at St. Stephen's Church. They have it reserved until Saturday the 21st, and it holds up to 500 people. Let's see, as it says on here, there's going to be a spokes council, an action spokes council on Tuesday. They're sponsoring a climate convergence on the 18th to the 21st, and then the final spokes council on the 19th. There's also a number of actions going on in D.C. On the 19th, we'll be at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that morning, protesting their meeting. Then we'll be at the Democratic National Campaign headquarters. Then there's an anti-nuke rally at Franklin Square, and then you see at the bottom of the slide here the deplorable. That is that's a protest outside of the National Press Club. Inside the National Policy Institute, a white supremacist organization, is going to be celebrating Trump's inauguration, and so we'll be outside protesting that. And then they have a concert going on that night, a benefit concert. Okay, the next slide. So big day is January 20th, and there are going to be blockade actions at various locations around the inaugural events, and each one is going to be themed. And so, as I said, there's a trade justice one. There's also anti-war, showing up for racial justice, climate justice, migrant rights and Palestinian rights, LGBTQ rights. Those are the ones that I can remember off the top of my head. But basically the entrance into the inaugural area begins early in the morning, and so many people are organizing those contingents starting fairly early. If you want to join us for the trade justice contingent, we're meeting at 6th and I Streets at 8 a.m., and then we'll march from there to our location. Let's see, after that, there's going to be a march from Union Station. It's called Columbus Circle. It's the area right in front of the train station, and that's called the Festival of Resistance. It is a permitted march that's going to be following kind of along a similar route to where the inaugural parade is, but parallel to it. That will end up at McPherson Square for a rally at 2 p.m. You can get more information about a lot of these events and find out about logistics at disruptj20.org. But just to comment on the trade justice contingent, we are going to be demanding that Trump hold to his promise to withdraw from the TPP, but also putting forward messaging to define what we want to see going forward. And that actually really brings me into my next section. Should I go ahead with that? So we can go to the next slide. So we had a tremendous win this year. We have to recognize, or last year, we have to recognize that more than 5 years of organizing by dedicated people all across the country in solidarity with people around the world built the political pressure to make something that was considered to be not an election issue or not something voters cared about to be the issue, which actually drove this election. And we stopped the TPP from being ratified this fall. So that's a huge win of people power. And now we really have to build off that, because that comes on the wins of the past decades when people rose up, organized, and stopped large trade agreements. And so we need to say to the power structure that we're going to rise up every time you put these forward and stop them, because we understand the risks that they carry to us, and that era of trade, rigged corporate trade, has to be over. And now we need to move forward with a new era that's open, that's transparent, that's inclusive, accountable, that's based on human rights and protection of the planet. We have to put forward a positive agenda. And this I'm saying because right now, what we're hearing inside some of the progressive groups and democratic circles, although I was glad to hear not so much of that tonight on the call, is that we shouldn't be putting forward a positive agenda. We should just be reactionary and defensive. And that's not how we build a movement. We build a movement by being bold and putting forward the solutions that we need, drawing people to those solutions to fight for them. And so the building blocks of how we're going to put forward a positive agenda are the same building blocks we used in the TPP fight, which is education, organization, and then mobilization. And like we did in the TPP, we have to recognize that our fight is a global fight, and not to be limited by borders, but understand that we're fighting for all people around the world, and we need to work in solidarity together. At Popular Resistance, we put together a positive agenda. It's called the People's Agenda, and actually if you're looking at the slide, you'll see it's the third link down, popularresistance.org, People's Agenda. This came out of the organizing work we did in 2011 to create the occupation of Washington, D.C., and then out of that occupation there were working groups on specific issues who came together and developed solutions they would like to see going forward. That has been further refined as movements have risen up, like the Black Lives Matter movement and others, to make it, reflective of where people are, where kind of the national consensus is in the country right now. So you can sign on to that People's Agenda and read it at that link. We are continuing the regular, what used to be the TPP resistance calls are now the National People's Agenda calls, and those are on Wednesday nights. It's not every Wednesday, it's generally every other Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. And those are really organizing calls to look at where we are, look at opportunities, and share what people are doing around the country. Likewise, if you look at the top link, tradeforpeopleandplanet.org, we switched over from Flush to TPP to Trade for People and Planet. We're continuing to post articles about what's going on with trade, and we will try to update some of the tools there as we are able to do that. We still have the action map, so if you're doing any kinds of local actions, you can share those with us there. You'll also find on tradeforpeopleandplanet.org more information about our trade justice contingent at Disrupt J20 and how to sign up for that. Let us know that you want to participate. I did want to mention quickly, because healthcare is an area that I've been fighting for as a pediatrician. It's been a very major issue for me, and I think Ben Beachy said at the beginning of the call, raised the concerns about what was happening with healthcare and what are we going to replace it with. I believe, and many of us believe, that right now is a critical time, not just to be fighting to save the Affordable Care Act, which has done what it was expected to do. It's continued to leave millions of people out and raise health care costs, but now we should be fighting for what we need, which is a national improved Medicare for all. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and that's another area that at Popular Resistance we'll be focusing a lot on this year as part of our Positive People's Agenda. So I'll stop there because it's late. But if anybody has questions, I'm happy to take those. Thank you.
So if anybody has a question for Margaret, press *6 and 1 when prompted.
Thanks very much, Harriet. Hello again, Dr. Flowers. I'm just wondering if you could tell me if you know of any group that's looking at utilizing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals for the year 2030 as a way of formulating a strategy on protecting human rights.
Thank you for that question, Alan. I'm not familiar with any groups that are focused on that, but I'll have to keep my eyes open for those.
Okay, because I think that does have tremendous value. Goal number 16 is dedicated to overhauling dysfunctional institutional culture, and that gives a real latitude for doing a lot of solving of stuff that does not make sense.
Great. Thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Alan. Maybe we can work together on that. Okay.
That would be good.
I don't see any. Oh, we do have another Nancy. It looks like Nancy is in the queue. Nancy, I believe your line is open.
Oh, thank you. So I wanted to ask Margaret, do you think that going back to the local municipal resolutions organizing might be fruitful in, or that we could talk about it more on some other call, on how to put this agenda together, Trade for People and Planet, and see if getting resolutions passed might be effective. And then I wanted to just comment on the individual who mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Whereas many of the goals are laudable, the problem is that the way that these goals are to be realized is the problem, and there's such corporate influence at the United Nations at the moment that a lot of that is going to be done through public-private partnerships. So we have to be very careful to lift up those goals, but also be very sure about how they're to be accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Nancy, for bringing that up, because that was definitely a concern that I have. If you're not familiar with it, you may want to check out something called the Global Redesign Initiative, which was developed by the World Economic Forum in 2010. And there's a good analysis of it by a man named Harris Fleckman at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. But it really is talking about further consolidating corporate collaboration with the United Nations. And one point that I meant to make, but I skipped over it, was that in our activism, it's really important for us, especially right now under the Trump administration, to remember that our jobs as activists are different from jobs of politicians. Our job as activists is to focus on the issue, no matter who is in power, and organize around that issue. And so we have to be independent of political party when we're putting forward our issues, not tie our issues to a party agenda. And we have to be really clear about what the solutions are that we're fighting for. Again, like you said, we're not looking for public-private partnerships. In Europe, they're trying to talk a lot about public-public partnerships. And then we have to be uncompromising in our fight, because we're really fighting on the fundamentals right now, on the solutions that we need to have a livable future. As far as the organizing municipally or in our local communities around these resolutions, I think it's an excellent idea. I mean, we still have to keep our eyes open for TTIP and TISA, and we do want to make the connections in our local communities about how these agreements impact us right at home. And so putting forward a positive agenda, I think, in local communities would be a great educational tool, as well as building that political pressure to push forward a positive agenda going forward.
We at Trade Justice wanted to invite all interested friends and allies to join us on a one-time Trade Justice Alliance 2017 agenda planning call. We figure that by early February we'll have a decent idea about, some of Trump's policies to be in 2017. So we're going to be holding an agenda call, and we'd like to get some input. So I've posted a link that Adam created for a doodle poll, and as I said, we will be posting this PowerPoint on our Facebook group. So, and I believe Adam will probably already also have it on our tradejustice.net site. So you can take the doodle poll and let us know what day and times work for you in February. So that's what we're going to be doing on that, and we would really like some input. We'd really welcome your input when it comes to an agenda for next year, or for this year, excuse me. And then we do have a call next month. We don't have the exact day worked out, but we do have some speakers lined up. The focus of the next call is going to be on the price of NAFTA. So currently we have Sujata Day as a speaker. She is a trade campaigner with the Council of Canadians. And we also have Celeste Drake, Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist with AFL-CIO, author and activist and blogger Pete Dolak. He has a blog called Systemic Disorder, and he's written some great articles on NAFTA and the effects, especially to Mexico, as I understand. And we'll also have Adam Wiseman on the call, and we're working on getting a speaker from Mexico because NAFTA was a tri-country disaster, and so we'd like to have representatives from all the countries. So that's pretty much it for tonight. Anybody that wants to stay on and chat afterwards, we certainly do welcome it. Otherwise, have a great evening.